The police officers stopped a couple and assaulted the wife right in front of her husband, unaware that he was the police captain. When the truth came to light, they were shocked by the consequences awaiting them. Walter Reed, an experienced and formidable police captain, was known for his tall, strong build and chiseled features. His sharp eyes and steadfast gaze commanded respect, but to friends and family, his eyes also revealed a caring and responsible nature. After dedicating decades to serving one of the city's most complex and challenging areas, Walter was no stranger to the darkest sides of life. From tense drug busts and family disputes ending in tragedy, to confrontations with the ruthless violence of the streets. Despite the hardships of his work, he remained committed to justice and integrity, even while navigating a system often clouded by prejudice and bias. But tonight was entirely different. Tonight, Walter was not just a brave police captain in the line of duty. He was a husband on the verge of becoming a father, a man facing a personal and urgent event beyond any mission he had encountered before. Above all, tonight was a test not only of courage, but of the family responsibility he cherished deeply. When his phone rang, Walter was across the city, finishing up paperwork for an important case. The screen displayed the name of his wife, Nancy, the person he regarded as his source of peace after long, exhausting days. He answered the call and immediately sensed something was wrong. Nancy's voice came through, trembling and interrupted by quick breaths. She was enduring pain and intense worry. "Walter, the contractions have started. I think it's time," Nancy said, her voice a mix of excitement and clear fear. Walter's heart raced as he felt a surge of adrenaline, his blood flowing faster than ever. Her words were not just an alert. They were a call to duty, a duty as a husband and soon-to-be father. He could hear the anxiety in her voice, but also sensed her trust in him to get her safely to the hospital, a place where she could deliver their baby with him by her side. They had talked about this moment many times, prepared mentally, taken prenatal classes, and discussed every detail of an emergency plan. But now those plans seemed fragile before reality, and emotions overwhelmed them. Without hesitation, Walter abandoned everything on his desk, grabbed his car keys, and rushed out of the station. He drove home as quickly as possible, genuinely wishing he would make it in time before things worsened. Known for his calm under pressure, he found this time to be different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line, but the lives of the people he loved most. The thought of Nancy in pain and their unborn child's uncertain safety threw him into a whirlwind of unfamiliar emotions, anxiety, fear, and an uncontrollable surge of excitement. As he navigated the city streets, Walter's mind raced with worry and fear. He wondered if he could reach home in time, if everything would go smoothly, and if Nancy and their child would be safe. With each passing second, the responsibility and love in his heart beat louder. Recalling the plans they had laid out, he tried to reassure himself that everything would be okay, that this was just a small test in the journey he and Nancy had prepared for. But then he realized no plan, no preparation could have readied him for the flood of emotions surging inside. Walter turned on his emergency lights, pressed the accelerator, and sped through the streets, disregarding speed limits, with only one goal in his mind: to reach home, to get Nancy to the hospital safely. He reminded himself that his colleagues on the road would understand his urgency, but he couldn't shake the worry that he could face trouble if no one understood the real reason behind his haste, especially because he knew he was a black man. And in this city, power could sometimes be a tool of abuse rather than protection. In the sparse evening traffic, Walter sped through intersections and side streets, his eyes constantly scanning to avoid obstacles. The closer he got to home, the more his anxiety mixed with the hope that he would arrive in time to ensure Nancy's safety. At that moment, Nancy and their unborn child were everything to him, the sole motivation keeping him racing forward in this urgent battle against time. Finally, after what felt like an endless drive, Walter arrived at the building where he and Nancy lived. The car came to a screeching halt, and Walter rushed out, his eyes filled with worry as he looked toward the entrance, his feet moving swiftly across the yard, knowing that every second counted. He practically flew up the stairs, each step echoing with his hurried footsteps, his mind focused solely on one thing: Nancy! When he entered their apartment, he found her in the living room, clutching her stomach, her body slightly hunched over to ease the pain. Her hair was damp with sweat, sticking to her forehead, her breathing fast and labored, her face tense with contractions. The moment she saw him, her eyes lit up with relief and an indescribable joy, as though Walter was the one anchor in this storm. "Walter, thank goodness you're here," she whispered, her voice trembling from the pain yet filled with complete trust. She reached out her hand to him, her eyes expressing the comfort his presence gave her. Walter immediately knelt beside her, his large, warm hand clasping hers firmly, radiating the calm and reassurance only he could bring. "I'm here, love. I won't let you go through this alone," he said in a deep, steady voice full of resolve. "I'll get you to the hospital. Everything's going to be all right." Carefully, he wrapped his arm around her waist, gently helping her to stand. Every movement was tender, as if he were handling the most fragile treasure. Nancy leaned. Against him, her legs shaky from the relentless waves of pain, her breathing uneven as each step became heavier. Together, they slowly made their way down the stairs, with Walter holding her close, whispering comforting words. "It's going to be all right, love. I'm right here." When they reached the car, he carefully opened the door and helped her into the seat. His gaze never left her face, watching her every expression to make sure she was okay. He buckled her seatbelt, his fingers moving gently, cautiously, as if afraid to cause her any more discomfort. Before starting the engine, he placed his hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes with depth and unwavering determination. "I'll get you there safely," he said, his voice steady and his eyes filled with fierce resolve. Nancy managed a small, shaky smile, her eyes reflecting her absolute trust in him, the comfort he brought her in this difficult moment. "I know," she whispered, her voice faint but filled with emotion. Walter turned back, his hands trembling slightly from the emotions overwhelming him, but he quickly regained his composure. He knew this was a moment when he had to be strong, the solid ground for the woman he loved and their soon-to-be-born child. As he started the car and accelerated, he kept his gaze forward, yet his heart pounded with a mixture of worry and determination. She meant everything to him, and in this moment, nothing was more important than getting her safely to the hospital. As they drove, he frequently glanced at her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his fingers tracing small circles as a way to calm her. Walter took deep, steady breaths, focusing on the road ahead, but in his mind he relived every joyful moment with her, from the day they met to the plans they had carefully made for this day. They had attended prenatal classes and discussed every possible scenario, but nothing could truly prepare him for the overwhelming love and concern he felt now. Throughout the journey, their eyes met occasionally, a silent exchange filled with everything they wanted to say without words. Just having Walter by her side gave Nancy the strength she needed, and Walter knew he would do anything to protect the woman he loved and their child soon to arrive. As Walter sped through the streets, his only hope was to get Nancy to the hospital safely. The emergency lights flashed urgently, but as Walter focused on the road ahead, he didn't notice the red and blue lights of a patrol car following close behind him. Just as Walter turned onto a major avenue, the flashing lights from the patrol car suddenly illuminated his rearview mirror, sending a surge of anxiety through him as he realized he was being pursued by the police. Although he tried to focus on getting Nancy to the hospital, Walter knew he couldn't ignore the patrol car behind him. He silently prayed the officers would understand the urgency of the situation when they saw Nancy in distress. Finally, he had no choice but to pull over, anxiously glancing at Nancy, who was writhing in pain, hoping he could quickly explain and get back on the road. When the car came to a stop, two officers stepped out of the patrol car, their faces cast in stern, unyielding expressions under the glare of their headlights. One of them was a tall man with a cold, suspicious gaze, while the other, shorter with a stockier build, wore a look of unmistakable disdain. They approached Walter's car, shining a flashlight directly into his face through the window. Walter rolled down the window, doing his best to remain calm. Before he could say a word, the taller officer pointed the flashlight at his face and barked, "What do you think you're doing driving at that speed, pal?" Walter took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice as steady as possible. "I'm sorry, but my wife, she's in labor. I need to get her to the hospital immediately." His voice held a desperate urgency, hoping they would grasp the gravity of the situation. The shorter officer narrowed his eyes, noticing the police badge on Walter's shirt, and smirked derisively. "Oh, so you're a police captain, huh?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm. You think that badge gives you the right to speed and break the law? Walter swallowed hard, attempting to explain further. I'm not trying to break any laws. It's just that this is an emergency. Please, my wife is in severe pain, and our baby is coming. But Walter's pleas only seemed to fuel the officer's suspicion, and they appeared to relish making things more difficult for him. The tall officer, with a stony glare, pointed outside the car, ordering, "Step out of the vehicle, now." Walter hesitated, glancing back at Nancy. She was grimacing in pain, clutching the seat with a pale face, her eyes filled with worry and a hint of fear. Walter knew he had no choice but to comply, hoping that cooperating would resolve the situation quickly. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible to avoid any misunderstandings. Facing the two officers, Walter tried once more to explain his emergency, but he could see the cold indifference in their eyes. The shorter officer moved closer, his voice laced with contempt. "Who do you think you are, driving like a maniac and breaking the law? You think being a captain means you get special privileges?" Walter maintained a steady but firm tone. "I'm only asking for some understanding. My wife is in an emergency. She needs to get to the hospital right now." The tall officer scoffed, showing no signs of empathy. Instead, his hand moved to his holster, a glint of threat in his eyes. "Listen here, buddy. If you don't cooperate right now, I won't hesitate to use force." Fear and anger surged within Walter. He was used to high-stakes situations at work, but this was the first time he felt genuinely threatened, not for his own life, but for the lives of Nancy and their unborn child. Walter took a deep breath, doing his best to remain calm. "Please, understand me. This is a life-or-death situation. I just want to get my wife to the hospital. Please, let us go." But his pleas were met with icy disdain. The shorter officer sneered, his tone mocking. "Don't even try to pull that excuse on us. I've met plenty of people who think they're special, but let me assure you, you're not." Walter clenched his fists, but he knew he couldn't afford to act rashly. Every second counted for Nancy, but if he did anything to resist, the situation could spiral even further out of control. He looked into the officer's eyes, trying one last time to reach them. "I'm only asking for compassion. Please, let us go. We can explain everything later. But right now, my wife is in urgent need of medical care." The tall officer smirked, his expression contemptuous, as if Walter were just another nobody, not a police captain. "Cooperate, or I'll show you what enforcing the law means," he threatened, his hand moving even closer to his gun. Walter felt a surge of helpless rage rising within him. He realized that these men had no intention of helping. They only wanted to flaunt their authority. Deep down, he also knew they might have held a bias against him the moment they saw him in the car. Standing before these two officers, Walter was no longer just a worried husband. He was also a man of color in a precarious situation that could be dangerously misinterpreted. He glanced back at the car, where Nancy continued to struggle with the pain, her eyes filled with tears and fear as she watched the escalating tension. Her gaze seemed to plead with him to find a way to get her out of this situation. This helplessness felt like a knife twisting in his heart. But he knew that, no matter how tense things got, he had to keep calm for Nancy and their unborn child. Walter took a deep breath, suppressing his frustration, and looked straight into the officer's eyes, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a bit of humanity. Please, just let us go." But his words fell into a void. The officer's expressions remained hostile and unyielding, like he was speaking to two unfeeling walls. Walter realized that every plea was in vain, but for Nancy and their young child, he had no choice but to endure, hoping he could somehow get her to safety before it was too late. Walter decided to take out his police badge, hoping it would help explain and de-escalate the tension, but the shorter officer quickly moved closer and snatched the wallet from his hand. He opened it, glanced at the badge, and sneered with contempt. "Really? A police captain?" he asked mockingly, his tone dripping with sarcasm, and his eyes filled with skepticism and disdain. "You think that title gives you the right to break the law? You think you're above everyone else?" Walter maintained his composure, trying to explain even as his heart raced with worry for Nancy. "My wife, she's in labor. She needs to get to the hospital immediately. I'm just asking for a bit of understanding." But the taller officer cut him off with a cold, challenging look. "You think you're special, huh, buddy? Think that because you're a captain, you get to do whatever you want, break any rule you feel like. From inside the car, Nancy, suffering and distressed, watched as her husband endured unwarranted humiliation and injustice. She tried to open the car door, even as the pain grew stronger, and weakly called out his name. "Please, I just need to get to the hospital. My husband hasn't done anything wrong," her voice trembling but filled with determination and desperation. The shorter officer turned around, his tone harsh and filled with anger, as if her presence was only adding to his annoyance. "Get back in the car! You're not allowed to get out!" he barked, his eyes cold, utterly devoid of compassion. Walter looked at Nancy trembling inside the car, her face pale with pain, yet her eyes full of resilience. In her gaze, Walter saw a silent empathy and encouragement. Even amidst intense pain, Nancy looked at him with a faint, brave smile, as if to say she understood and believed in him, that she would stand by him through this. Her eyes sent him an unspoken message. "Stay calm, for me and the baby." That moment filled Walter with profound emotion. Nancy's love and resilience, even in the throes of labor, reminded him why he had to remain calm and strong. No matter how difficult the situation or how unfairly he was treated, Walter knew he had to suppress his anger and let nothing cloud his judgment. But just as Walter took a deep breath to regain his composure, the taller officer suddenly stepped forward, shoving him hard on the shoulder, causing him to stumble. "Stay put! Don't even think about resisting," he shouted, his voice filled with authority and threat. Walter staggered but managed to keep his balance, looking at the officer with fury in his eyes, but holding his silence. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm just asking you to let us go. My wife is in pain and needs urgent medical attention." His plea was met with nothing but a mocking laugh from the shorter officer. He stepped up close to Walter, sneering with disdain. "Don't think we'll go easy on you just because you're a captain. You're just another guy. And if you don't cooperate, we'll make you cooperate." Walter clenched his fists, the anger rising in his chest. He knew he didn't deserve to be treated this way, but any attempt to resist would only worsen the situation. And the last thing he wanted was to endanger Nancy and their unborn child. He looked at the officer with determination, trying to convey the sincerity and urgency of the situation he was facing. From inside the car, Nancy, though in pain, observed everything. She could see the unfairness her husband was enduring and felt his hurt and frustration. Yet she patiently kept her gaze on him, her eyes wet with tears yet full of strength and hope. Even in pain, she managed a faint smile at him, a fragile but deeply loving and supportive smile. She wanted him to know she understood the helplessness he was experiencing and that, no matter what, she was on his side. When Walter looked into Nancy's eyes, he felt a powerful surge of motivation within him. He remembered all they had been through together, the sacrifices and hardships, and he knew he had to keep calm and composed, not just for himself, but for Nancy and their soon-to-be-born child. At that moment, Walter understood that their love and resilience would be the strength he needed to face any hostility or injustice. He would not let anyone harm his family, and even if he had to endure humiliation, he would stand firm because, in Nancy's eyes, he saw her unwavering trust and hope. Amid the darkness and the flashing lights of the police car, their love and strength shone brightly, reminding him that they would overcome everything, no matter the challenges and trials ahead. Meanwhile, a young man passing by was drawn to the shouting and flashing lights of the police car. As he approached, he saw a tense and alarming scene. A black man being restrained by two police officers while a woman in the car cried out in pain. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and began recording the entire situation. He could sense the injustice unfolding right in front of him and knew that if he didn't do something, the truth might be buried. He posted the video on social media with a brief caption: "Police captain and his wife in labor treated with brutality and unfairness. It's time to demand justice." The video quickly went viral, and within minutes, thousands of views and comments began flooding in. Viewers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Outrage erupted as people expressed shock and anger over the officers' actions. Their cold, inhumane, and abusive behavior sparked widespread indignation. Comments poured in under the video, with many criticizing and expressing fury at the officers' actions while demanding that authorities take immediate action. The public's attention grew rapidly, and the pressure from social media began to weigh heavily on the scene unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, the two officers noticed the skeptical, disapproving gazes from the gathering crowd. The glow from cell phones recording them served as a warning, making them realize that their actions were no longer hidden from the public eye. However, rather than stopping, the shorter officer appeared visibly uneasy and irritated. He shouted at the crowd, "Nobody interferes with this. This is official business. Everyone back off." But his voice no longer held the confidence it once had. There was an unmistakable hint of worry and fear. Walter, though restrained against the car, realized that the situation might be shifting. The eyes of the crowd, the recording phones, and especially the angered expression of the young man who had stepped up to help him, all served as a morale boost, making him feel less alone. A glimmer of hope surfaced within him that maybe, just maybe, the truth wouldn't be buried this time. Nancy, sitting in the car, noticed the concerned looks of those around and the growing crowd. Despite the intensifying pain, she felt some comfort in seeing people standing up for her and Walter. She knew that the young man's video might be their only hope of finding justice. Under the pressure from the crowd and the anger of those witnessing the event, the two officers began to show signs of hesitation. The shorter officer, who had initially acted tough, now displayed evident worry. He looked at his partner, his face betraying confusion and frustration, uncertain about what to do next. Both officers seemed to understand that every move they made was now under tight scrutiny and that any misstep could be used as evidence against them. Meanwhile, Walter, though held firmly in place, continued to try to speak to the officers with a calm but determined voice. "My wife is in an emergency. We just need to get to the hospital. Please, reconsider." The taller officer turned to look at Walter, his face full of anger, but this time with a hint of worry in his eyes. He knew that everything he was doing was being recorded and that any action that crossed the line could lead to severe consequences. He hesitated for a moment, but tried to maintain his authoritative tone. "We'll handle everything according to protocol. If you don't cooperate, we'll continue to do our job as required." The tension continued to escalate as murmurs from the crowd grew louder, with increasingly clear words of criticism. "Don't they see she's in pain?" someone from the crowd shouted. "Come on, they just need to get to the hospital," protested another voice, full of frustration. The shouting and calls from the crowd seemed to erode the officers' confidence. They understood they couldn't escape the watchful eyes of the public and that their actions had become the center of attention. The two officers exchanged worried glances, appearing to reconsider their approach to the situation. As the tense confrontation between Walter and the two officers reached its peak, an unmarked car screeched to a halt at the scene. Walter looked up and saw a familiar figure, Keith David, a veteran detective and his closest friend. Keith stepped out of the car, his eyes filled with fury and determination, as he took in the distressing situation Walter and Nancy were enduring. Known throughout the department as a tough but righteous detective, Keith couldn't believe his eyes as he saw his longtime colleague being treated like a criminal in the middle of the street by two younger officers. He quickly approached Walter, his gaze radiating outrage. Under the glow of the crowd's phone lights, Keith appeared like a guardian, and the people around fell silent, watching his every step. Keith walked straight up to the two officers, his gaze icy. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" His voice rang out powerfully, clear and authoritative, startling the two officers. "This is Chief Walter Reed, and you're preventing him from taking his wife to the hospital while she's in labor. Do you realize the gravity of what you're doing?" The officers, already somewhat shaken by the pressure from the crowd and the recording phones around them, grew visibly more nervous upon Keith's arrival. They exchanged anxious looks, realizing the situation had escalated now that a high-ranking and respected detective was involved. The shorter officer, appearing flustered but trying to keep his voice steady, replied, We're just doing our duty. He was speeding, and we have the right to pull him over." Keith raised an eyebrow, his gaze reflecting pure anger. He stepped closer to the shorter officer, his tone low but firm. "Doing your duty does not mean abusing your power. No regulation permits you to treat a family in a critical situation with such aggression. Can you not see her condition?" Keith pointed toward Nancy, who lay weakly in the car, her face twisted in pain as the contractions intensified. "This is not the time for a power trip. Your behavior is unethical and unprofessional." The two officers, especially the taller one, lost much of the confidence they'd shown earlier. He looked down, avoiding Keith's gaze, mumbling, We didn't know the situation was this serious." Keith shook his head, his face filled with disappointment. "Didn't know it was serious? You didn't even bother asking about her condition. All you saw was his skin color, and because of that, you overstepped your authority. This is my colleague, a man who has dedicated his life to upholding justice, and yet this is how you treat him?" Walter, still held against the car, felt a surge of hope and relief as he saw his loyal friend standing up for him and Nancy, willing to confront the officers to protect them. Walter knew that Keith was more than just a colleague. He was a friend who had his back, especially in the hardest moments. Keith turned to Walter, his eyes full of empathy and regret. He placed a firm hand on Walter's shoulder, speaking softly yet with determination. "Walter, I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. This should never have happened. They've crossed a line and I'll make sure they're held accountable." Walter nodded, feeling a mixture of sorrow and humiliation, but Keith's presence sparked a glimmer of hope. He knew his friend wouldn't let this incident be swept under the rug and would fight to protect him and Nancy to the end. Keith turned back to face the officers, his gaze cold and voice unyielding. "Listen up. I'm going to report everything that happened here to our superiors, and I'll ensure that you're held accountable for your abuse of power. This isn't just a wrongful act. It's a deep offense against my colleague and his wife. Don't think for a moment that this will go unnoticed. I'll personally see this matter through." The officers seemed overwhelmed by Keith's piercing gaze and the murmurs from the crowd. They were left without any defense, their faces shifting from arrogant confidence to anxious regret. The shorter officer quietly nodded, avoiding eye contact, while the taller one no longer dared to meet Keith or Walter's eyes. The crowd around them, witnessing Keith's resolute intervention, felt reassured and relieved. A few people nodded in agreement, understanding that justice was being restored through the intervention of a righteous figure. Phones continued to record every moment, capturing undeniable evidence of how the officers had treated Walter and Nancy. Keith approached Walter's car and leaned down to speak to Nancy, his eyes soft and compassionate. "Nancy, are you okay? I'm going to make sure you get to the hospital right away. No one has the right to stop you in this moment." Nancy, her forehead damp with sweat from the pain, looked up at Keith with grateful, tearful eyes. "Thank you, Keith," she whispered, her voice weak from the contractions. "We wouldn't know what to do if you hadn't come." Keith gently squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Nancy. You and Walter aren't alone. I'll make sure justice is served and that you're treated with the respect you deserve." After speaking to Nancy, Keith straightened up, his expression becoming serious once more as he turned back to the officers. "Now, I'll be escorting them to the hospital. If you have any intention of interfering further, go ahead and try, but I promise you, every action you take here tonight will be fully reported and made public." The officers had no courage left to resist. They exchanged looks, silently stepping back and avoiding Keith and Walter's eyes. The arrogance and authority they displayed earlier had completely vanished, replaced by shame and fear. Keith helped Walter back into the car and ensured Nancy was secure and comfortable. As he closed the car door, he spoke to Walter, his tone filled with resolve. "I won't let this get swept under the rug, Walter. I'll do everything I can to ensure justice is done. There's no place in our force for this kind of abuse and heartlessness." Walter looked at Keith with deep gratitude, his eyes showing appreciation and determination. "Thank you, Keith. You've always been there for me when I needed you most. We'll get justice, not just for Nancy and me, but for everyone who's had to endure this kind of mistreatment." Keith nodded, his eyes warm, but filled with a fierce resolve. "We'll fight to the end, Walter. This isn't just your battle. It's our mission to protect the values we've sworn to uphold." As the two colleagues and friends stood together, they felt a deep sense of unity and shared purpose. The crowd around them watched with admiration, trusting that justice would not be forgotten. This was only the beginning of a long road, but Walter knew that with Keith's support, he would no longer face injustice alone. As Keith stepped back, his stern gaze remained fixed on the two officers standing before him. These two, who had initially acted with arrogance and abuse of power, now seemed to realize that the situation had spiraled beyond their control. Under pressure from Keith and the angry stares of the surrounding crowd, the officers hesitantly approached Walter and Nancy, delivering an apology that they were forced to utter. The shorter officer, with a reluctant expression, spoke first. "I apologize for the trouble we caused you and your wife," and he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We were just doing our job. If we went too far, I hope you can understand and forgive us." His apology sounded disjointed, lacking in sincerity, clearly uttered only to avoid further consequences. Walter looked directly at the officer, bitterness welling up inside him. He could see that these words were not born from genuine remorse, but were merely a shield against impending repercussions. When the taller officer stepped forward, however, his expression was markedly different. His eyes revealed genuine shame, and he lowered his head slightly before Walter and Nancy. "I am truly sorry," he said, his voice low and tinged with unease. "I didn't realize how serious the situation was. I allowed power and prejudice to cloud my judgment. Only when Detective David arrived and I understood the full context did I realize my mistake." Walter felt a hint of surprise, sensing the officer's sincerity. Though anger still burned within him, he recognized that this man stood before him with a genuine desire to make amends. The officer bowed his head further, his voice trembling with genuine regret. "Walter, I know that my words cannot undo what happened, but I want to commit to changing the way I work. I'll learn from this mistake and ensure I never repeat it." Walter stood still, feeling a faint spark of hope. Though he continued to feel betrayed and wounded, he understood that, at times, true remorse could be the catalyst for change. He looked directly into the officer's eyes, his voice steady but firm. "I hope you remember that our job is not only to enforce the law, but also to protect and respect people's rights." Keith stood silently beside them, observing the entire interaction. He sensed a small yet significant shift in the taller officer's attitude. Sometimes a moment like this could awaken a person's conscience. Keith knew that these apologies could be the first step toward reshaping their understanding of their responsibilities. When the apologies were finally spoken, whether sincere or forced, Keith turned back to Walter and Nancy with a reassuring look. He nodded, signaling that it was time for them to continue their journey to the hospital. Keith stepped forward, opened the car door, and helped Walter make sure Nancy was settled comfortably in her seat. Once he ensured everything was secure, he faced the officers one last time, his gaze cold, his words firm. "I'll be escorting these two to the hospital now. If anyone intends to interfere further or abuse their authority again, I'll make sure every action is fully reported and exposed in the name of justice." The officers had no courage left to protest. They exchanged uneasy glances, then quietly stepped back toward their patrol car, avoiding the eyes of both Keith and Walter. The confidence and bravado they had displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced by discomfort and shame. Walter watched them retreat, still feeling the weight of the situation, but his eyes shone with resolve. He knew this story was far from over, and these apologies, whether genuine or not, were only the beginning of a long journey toward justice. Keith helped him back into the car, his gaze filled with comfort and understanding. "We won't let this fade into obscurity, Walter. I'm committed to seeing this through to the end to ensure justice is served for you and Nancy. They will be held accountable for what they did," Keith said with firm resolve. Walter nodded, feeling the solid support of his loyal friend. As the car started moving, Keith activated his patrol lights and escorted them on the road to the hospital. The flashing lights led the way, allowing Walter and Nancy to reach safety more quickly. Throughout the drive, Walter held Nancy's hand tightly, his gaze tender, assuring her that everything was nearly over and that peace was finally within reach. Nancy, despite the unrelenting pain, felt a sense of relief and safety with Keith by their side. She knew that she and Walter were not alone and that Keith's friendship had been a source of strength, helping them endure this night. When they arrived at the hospital, Walter looked back down the road they had traveled, his heart filled with complex emotions. Tonight's events had been a profound lesson, a reminder that, sometimes, only in moments of pain and challenge do we see people's true nature. He recalled the taller officer's genuine apology, a reminder that, no matter how bleak things become, there is always the potential for awakening and change. As they stopped in front of the hospital, Keith remained steadfast, ready to protect his friends until the end. He watched Walter and Nancy step out, his eyes warm yet determined. He knew that this fight wasn't just about Walter and Nancy. It was a battle against the injustice that they, as police officers, had to confront and overcome. Walter turned back, taking Keith's hand in silent gratitude. His gaze was filled with deep appreciation and resolve. Keith nodded, a silent promise that he would always stand by his friend. "Don't worry, Walter. We'll fight to the end, not just for you two, but for everyone who has ever faced injustice," Keith said, his voice steady and full of determination. As Walter and Nancy entered the hospital, they finally found a measure of peace after a long night of tension and pain. But they knew this was only the beginning. Walter was resolved to do everything in his power to ensure the truth would come to light and justice would be served, not only for him and Nancy, but for everyone else. Keith watched them fade into the hospital corridor, his heart filled with determination and the profound bonds of friendship. Tonight had been a powerful reminder of the values he and Walter cherished: justice, loyalty, and a deep sense of duty. This was only the beginning of a struggle, but he believed that, with perseverance and conviction, they would bring about true change and justice. After Nancy safely gave birth, Walter sat beside her hospital bed, gazing at the peaceful face of their newborn daughter sleeping in her mother's arms. In that moment, all his emotions seemed to settle, enveloped in a sense of family happiness and love. But as he looked into Nancy's eyes, memories of that harrowing night flooded back. Flashing lights, insults, the helplessness of seeing his wife disrespected and himself treated like a criminal in the middle of the street. He realized he could not stay silent and let this matter go. This offense was not only a threat to his dignity, but also to the future of his child and the world he wanted to protect and preserve for her. Walter resolved to seek justice, not only for his family, but also to prevent others from enduring the same humiliation and powerlessness. He knew he had to do this to uphold his belief in justice and the responsibility he had dedicated his life to. This was a fight he could not avoid, and Walter was determined to bring the incident to light. The next day, as soon as Nancy and their daughter were moved to the recovery room, Walter began carrying out his plan. He met with Keith, his loyal friend and a most trusted colleague, to map out the next steps. Keith, who had witnessed the injustice that night, fully supported Walter's decision. He wasn't just a friend, but a powerful ally, ready to stand by Walter in this challenging battle. Keith placed a reassuring hand on Walter's shoulder, his gaze filled with resolve. "You know you're not fighting this alone, right? I'll stand by you no matter what happens." Keith's words gave Walter strength, and he knew he could rely on his friends, loyalty, and integrity. Walter and Keith both understood that evidence was key to exposing the incident. They started by reaching out to the young man who had filmed the rough treatment Walter and Nancy endured. His video had already spread widely on social media, attracting thousands of views and a wave of public outrage. The young man, upon learning that Walter was seeking justice, readily provided the original video and pledged to testify if needed. The video became a crucial piece of evidence, but they didn't stop there. Walter and Keith began calling for other witnesses, including those who had seen the incident and those who had courageously contacted the police department when it occurred. Each statement, each video clip, and each photo became valuable pieces, assembling a complete picture of the truth about that night. Walter understood that this fight was not just his own. It represented everyone who had ever suffered injustice, discrimination, and abuse of power from those entrusted with upholding the law. To garner widespread support, he decided to reach out to the community and human rights organizations. Walter and Keith contacted multiple nonprofit organizations focused on protecting human rights and fighting discrimination. These organizations quickly rallied around Walter, not just because he was a police chief, but because he was a father, a husband, and a citizen fighting for values he believed in. A wave of community support began to form. Walter's story appeared in the media and spread widely. Major newspapers, television programs, and even celebrities spoke out in support of him. News articles analyzing the incident, interviews, and social media posts were constantly updated, calling for justice for Walter's family and condemning the abuse of power. On social media, thousands expressed their outrage at the way Walter and Nancy had been treated, while also calling for systemic reform. Walter felt his heart warmed by the empathy and support of so many people. This gave him greater confidence that justice would be served, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been mistreated and discriminated against. He realized this was no longer a personal battle, but a movement, a call for reform and transparency within law enforcement. Meanwhile, the two officers involved were scrambling to defend themselves and avoid accountability. They argued that they were simply following protocol and had no intention of disrespecting Walter. But with video evidence and witness testimonies, their abuse of power and dismissive attitudes were laid bare. The surge of public outrage would not allow them to escape the consequences of their actions easily. Despite the strong support, Walter and Keith still faced significant obstacles within the judicial system. They knew that filing a lawsuit against those in power was no easy task, especially within a system still riddled with barriers and protections for offenders within law enforcement. However, the unity of the community and their unwavering determination kept them moving forward through every challenge. Keith kept Walter updated on the case's progress and even organized meetings with human rights attorneys to explore the best legal strategies. When the case finally went to court, Walter's story became a beacon in the community. Others who had experienced discrimination and abuse of power began to come forward, sharing their stories and supporting Walter. Some even organized peaceful protests, demanding transparency and accountability within the police force. Messages like "Justice for All" and "Stop Abuse of Power" appeared across media outlets and social networks, turning Walter's fight into a nationwide movement. This movement extended beyond Walter City, reaching other cities and states. People everywhere began to realize that they too had the right to demand justice and accountability from those charged with protecting them. The solidarity and strength of the community gave Walter renewed faith and fierce motivation, helping him stay resolute despite the challenges ahead. As the trial date approached, Walter knew this would be a pivotal moment in his life in the movement he had helped spark. He understood that he had to prepare as best as possible, not just for his family, but for all those watching and hoping for justice. With Keith and a team of committed lawyers, Walter meticulously prepared every detail to ensure that justice would prevail. On the way to the courthouse, Walter looked at Nancy and their newborn daughter with a gaze full of love and determination. This was no longer just a fight for his honor. It was a fight for his family, for justice, and for those who had no voice. Walter knew that, regardless of the outcome, he would never stop fighting for the values he held dear. Sitting beside him in the car, Keith placed a supportive hand on his shoulder and smiled encouragingly. "You're going to do great, Walter. This is our chance to bring justice to light. I'll be right here with you through it all." Walter squeezed Keith's hand, his heart filled with gratitude and resolve. He felt supported not only by his closest friend, but by the entire community, by those who had risen alongside him in this fight. Walter knew that no matter the verdict, he had inspired many to stand up for justice, and that he had planted seeds of hope for a fairer future. Entering the courtroom, Walter felt a surge of newfound strength, a powerful belief that justice would prevail. He was ready to face the challenge, not only for himself, but for all who longed for justice within a system that had once eroded their trust. The trial began under an air of intense anticipation that filled the courtroom. Walter took a deep breath, feeling his heart pounding but steady. He looked around, meeting the eyes of residents who had come to support him. They too had faced similar injustices, and their presence reminded Walter that this fight was not his alone. Walter's attorney, an experienced and passionate advocate, began laying out the case. He analyzed every detail, presenting irrefutable evidence of abuse of power and systemic failures that Walter had endured. Each word he spoke carried weight, aiming to dismantle any possible excuses from the opposition. The defense attorneys, equally determined, used tactics to sow doubt, trying to weaken the evidence and distort the truth. Walter sat quietly, listening intently, his heart resolute. He knew this would be an intense battle of wits, one requiring steadfast patience and unwavering strength. When it was Walter's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He slowly approached the stand, his gaze unyielding. He began recounting every detail he had endured, each instance of injustice, every feeling of being marginalized in the shadows. His voice was strong, and each word resonated with truth and emotion, touching everyone in the room. Walter spoke. "Today, I stand here, not only to seek justice for myself, but to give voice to all those who have been wronged and disheartened by this system. I believe that if we do not stand up, if we simply accept it in silence, then injustice will continue to spread, and our children will endure suffering they should never have to face." Walter's words reached everyone's hearts, and he saw many supportive, tearful gazes in the room. The jury listened intently, moved by his sincerity and determination. After Walter's testimony, his attorney continued to build the case, skillfully emphasizing key points and linking them to evidence with logical and compelling arguments. He stressed that this was not just a lawsuit, but an opportunity for the system to correct its wrongs, to show that justice is not an abstract concept, but a right that everyone deserves. The trial extended over hours as arguments from both sides interwove, but the atmosphere seemed to lean toward Walter's favor. His sincerity, resolve, and unyielding belief in justice resonated deeply. Finally, after tense moments of waiting, the jury adjourned for deliberation. Walter left the stand, feeling a mix of relief and hope. He knew that whatever the outcome, he had fought with everything he had, and at the very least, he had done all he could to bring about change. When the jury returned to the courtroom, an air of silent anticipation hung over the room. All eyes turned to the judge, awaiting the verdict. Walter sat beside Nancy, holding her hand tightly as a show of strength. She looked back at him, her eyes shining with pride and love. They had endured so much together, and now they faced this pivotal moment as one. The judge surveyed the courtroom before delivering the verdict, his voice solemn and steady. After careful review of all evidence and testimonies, the jury finds that the two officers in question grievously abused their authority, not only harming Walter, but also eroding public trust in the justice system. Walter felt his chest swell with emotion. This was the moment he and Nancy had longed for. The truth and justice finally acknowledged publicly. The judge continued, "As such, the jury rules that the two officers will be dismissed from their positions, required to compensate Walter for damages, and face appropriate legal penalties." At the conclusion, Nancy embraced Walter tightly, her eyes filled with joyous relief. At last, the suffering they had endured was vindicated. She whispered in his ear, "You did it, Walter. Justice has won." Walter turned to Nancy, his gaze reflecting his deep gratitude and love for his steadfast wife. In the courtroom, applause began to swell from those who had supported him. They had witnessed the relentless fight of Walter and Nancy, and now they could not contain their emotion as justice was served. Walter rose, joined by Nancy, bowing in gratitude to the judge and his attorney, who had stood by them throughout this battle. When the trial concluded and justice was served, Walter and Nancy walked out of the courtroom with a sense of relief and pride. Although the trial was just the first step in a long journey, it demonstrated that ordinary people like them could demand justice and fairness in a flawed system. The entire community had stood by them, supporting, encouraging, and rallying not only for their rights, but also for fairness for all. On the way home, Walter reflected on everything he had gone through. This challenging journey profoundly transformed him from someone who simply upheld the law to someone who fought for true justice and equality. He realized that not only his family, but many others out there longed for protection and fair treatment. Arriving home, Walter held his newborn daughter in his arms, looking into her innocent eyes. He knew that she was his motivation to keep fighting. That night, sitting by his daughter's bedside and watching Nancy smile in her sleep, Walter silently promised himself, "I will build a world where you can grow up without fear, without worrying about who you are or the color of your skin. I will do everything to ensure you can proudly live in a world where justice is for everyone." The next morning, Walter met with Keith and other colleagues to discuss the next steps. For Walter, the lawsuit was not an ending but the beginning of a movement. He wanted to fight for justice, not only for his family, but to reform the law enforcement system. He understood that only when everyone in the industry fully embraced their responsibility and mission could society become safer and fairer. With Keith and the community's support, Walter decided to engage more deeply in reform movements. He began organizing meetings and discussions with community leaders and those who had also been victims of abuse and discrimination. These gatherings became a space for sharing stories, where people could tell their own experiences and seek mutual support. Walter also began reaching out to nonprofit and human rights organizations for assistance and collaboration. He understood that to create real change, he would need support from many sides. These organizations willingly helped Walter organize workshops and training sessions for police officers to foster awareness and responsibility for citizens' rights. Walter believed that only when law enforcement internalized the principles of justice and compassion Could society become safer and healthier? Gradually, Walter's story spread not only throughout his city, but to other areas as well. People, near and far, heard about his and Nancy's struggle. The media quickly picked up on the story, continuously reporting on the movement Walter had initiated. Newspapers, television programs, and social media posts poured in, creating a wave of public support. Victims of discrimination and abuse now felt empowered to speak up, to tell their stories, and to demand justice. The number of people joining Walter's movement grew. Ordinary citizens, social activists, and even some like-minded police officers raised their voices in support. They joined peaceful protests, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Abuse of Power." Not only local citizens, but also many international organizations that took notice of Walter's movement. They sent their congratulations and pledged support in his fight against injustice. Leading human rights organizations continuously reached out to him, offering financial and legal aid, and even police training to improve the force's quality and ethics. Walter's persistence began to yield results. The police force started facing pressure to reform. Leaders in the sector had to implement new regulations on conduct, enhance internal oversight, and organize training on empathy and responsibility for officers. These programs helped officers understand their responsibilities better and taught them how to empathize, to put themselves in the shoes of those they served. Walter was invited to speak at major reform conferences, where he frequently shared his story. Each time he recounted it, he emphasized the importance of enforcing justice with integrity and impartiality. He believed that sharing his story served not only as a reminder of the importance of fairness, but also as an inspiration for future generations. New officers joining the force began to see their roles differently. They understood that they were not just law enforcers, but also protectors of citizens' rights and safety. Walter's presence in the field served as a reminder of the noble values they needed to uphold. One evening, as Walter and Nancy strolled through the park with their young daughter, he watched children playing and laughing all around. He looked at his daughter's innocent face and pure smile and promised himself he would do everything to protect that smile. He knew this fight might last a lifetime, but he was undaunted. With every action, Walter hoped that one day his daughter would grow up in a world where she could take pride in a father who never stopped fighting for justice. Walter sat beside his daughter, holding her close. He whispered to her, as an eternal promise, "I will build a world where you are free to be yourself, without fear because of your skin color or anything else. I will fight so you can grow up in a fair and safe society." Nancy sat beside him, quietly holding Walter's hand, her eyes sparkling with pride and love. "You've done more than you realize, Walter. Not just for us, but for so many others. You've inspired them, and I believe future generations will remember you as a symbol of justice." Walter turned to Nancy, his eyes full of gratitude and resolve. They knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but neither had any intention of giving up. They had created change, and they would continue to uphold it, not just for themselves, but for everyone who longed for a brighter future. Walter's life became a symbol of perseverance and courage in the fight for justice. He continued participating in conferences and reform programs, and tirelessly advocating to ensure these changes would not be forgotten. Walter knew he was fighting not only for his family, but for all those who had felt forgotten and unjustly treated. In the years that followed, Walter and Nancy watched their daughter grow up in an improved world. Although there was still much work to do, they saw their efforts had not been in vain. They had laid a foundation for the future, a future where fairness and compassion would be the stronghold of society. And when Walter looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw all the hopes and dreams he had worked so hard to fulfill. It was a world where everyone had the right to be respected, to live without fear, and to be free from discrimination. Walter knew he had laid the first bricks for a brighter future, one where his daughter and all children could live in peace and freedom. With steadfast resolve and love for his family, Walter continued his journey, forever a warrior for justice and equality, not just for today, but for generations to come. This incredible story reminds us of the importance of defending justice and standing against abuse of power in all circumstances. Walter never backed down, ready to demand fairness not only for himself and his family, but for the community. If you were in his shoes, would you have the courage to stand up and seek justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to follow more inspiring stories like this. See you next time.
Officer James Mitchell sat in his police cruiser, watching cars pass by on Cedar Street. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel as his eyes scanned each driver. It was something he did every Friday afternoon, sitting in the same spot near the intersection where people rushed home from work. But Mitchell wasn't looking for speeders or drunk drivers. He had a different target in mind. At 45 years old, Mitchell had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years. He wore his blonde hair in a military-style cut and kept his uniform perfectly pressed. To many people in town, he looked like the perfect example of a police officer. The shiny badge on his chest and the crisp blue uniform helped him hide who he really was. "Another one," he mumbled to himself, pulling out behind a black SUV driven by a young African-American man. Mitchell didn't even bother looking for a real reason to stop the car. He knew how to make up excuses that would sound good in his report later. Failed to signal properly, he would write, or suspicious driving pattern. After 15 years, he had learned all the right words to use. Back at the police station, everyone knew about Mitchell's habits. Some younger officers looked uncomfortable when he bragged about his arrests in the break room, but nobody said anything. Mitchell had friends in high places. The police union representative was his golf buddy, and he regularly had dinner with two of the senior sergeants. "Just doing my job," he would say with a smile whenever someone questioned his high number of arrests. "Keeping our streets safe." The fact that almost all of his arrests involved minorities was something nobody talked about openly. But things in Millbrook were about to change, even though Mitchell didn't know it yet. In a large office building downtown, Sarah Lawrence Wilson was working late at her desk. Papers were spread out in front of her. Dozens of complaints from Black and Hispanic residents about unfair treatment by police. As one of the few Black female attorneys in town, people trusted her with their stories. Sarah was no ordinary lawyer. She had graduated at the top of her class from law school and had won several big cases against powerful companies. But what made her even more special was something Officer Mitchell had no idea about. She was married to Captain David Wilson, the second highest ranking officer in the Millbrook Police Department. Their marriage wasn't a secret, but Sarah had kept her married name off her office door and business cards on purpose. She and David had talked about it when she first opened her law practice. "I want to succeed or fail based on my own work," she had told him, "not because I'm the captain's wife." David had understood completely. Now, as the sun began to set outside her office window, Sarah added another file to her growing collection. A young Black college student had come to her that morning, crying as she told Sarah about being held at the side of the road for over an hour during a traffic stop. The officer's name in the report was James Mitchell. "That's the third complaint about him this month," Sarah said quietly to herself, making a note in her computer. She didn't know yet that she would soon have her own experience to add to the files. In another part of town, Captain David Wilson was packing his bags for a 3-day police conference in the state capitol. He kissed Sarah goodbye at their front door. "Be careful while I'm gone," he said, like he always did. Sarah smiled and straightened his tie. "I'm always careful," she replied. "You be safe too." Neither of them could have guessed what would happen in the next 24 hours. They didn't know that Officer Mitchell was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. They didn't know that his habit of targeting Black drivers was about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. As night fell over Millbrook, 3 different lives were moving toward a collision course. Officer Mitchell went home feeling proud of another day of what he called good police work. Sarah stayed late at her office, building a case against police discrimination. And Captain Wilson drove toward the state capitol, his phone turned off for the long drive ahead. The stage was set. Tomorrow would change everything. The next day started like any other for Sarah Lawrence Wilson. She spent the morning in court, won a small claims case for her client, and worked through lunch at her desk. By 6 in the evening, she was tired and ready to head home. The setting sun painted the sky orange as she got into her black Mercedes. Sarah always followed a strict routine when driving. She checked her mirrors twice, kept both hands on the wheel, and drove exactly at the speed limit. As a Black woman, she knew that even the smallest mistake could lead to trouble. Her husband David had taught her all the proper responses if she ever got pulled over. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, and stay polite no matter what. She was less than 10 minutes from home when she saw the police lights flashing in her mirror. Sarah took a deep breath and pulled over carefully, turning on her interior lights so the officer could see clearly inside her car. In her rearview mirror, she watched Officer Mitchell walk toward her car, his hand resting on his gun. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded, not even bothering to say hello. His flashlight beam hit Sarah's face directly, making her squint. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm going to reach for my purse to get my license. It's in the passenger seat." She moved her hand slowly, just like David had taught her. Mitchell snatched the documents from her hand. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I don't," Sarah answered truthfully. She had been driving perfectly, and they both knew it. "You were swerving?" Mitchell lied, his voice filled with fake concern. "Have you been drinking?" Sarah kept her voice steady. "No, sir. I don't drink. I'm coming from my law office downtown. I was driving straight and following all traffic laws." Mitchell's face changed when she mentioned being a lawyer. His friendly act disappeared. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "May I ask why, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Sarah started recording on her phone, keeping it out of sight. "Out! Now!" Mitchell's voice got louder. "Or are you resisting?" Sarah knew her rights, but she also knew how dangerous this situation could be. She slowly got out of her car, keeping her hands where Mitchell could see them. The evening air was cold against her face. "Walk in a straight line," Mitchell ordered, even though he hadn't done any of the proper procedures for a sobriety test. Sarah did as she was told, walking perfectly straight in her high heels. "Officer, I'd like to call my husband now. This stop is unnecessary, and you haven't given me a valid reason." "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job." Mitchell's face turned red. "Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for drunk driving and resisting an officer." "I'm not resisting, and I'm not drunk," Sarah said clearly, making sure her phone was still recording. "This is an illegal arrest, and you know it." Mitchell roughly grabbed her arms and put on the handcuffs. "We'll see how smart you are down at the station." He didn't bother reading her rights or following proper arrest procedures. As Mitchell pushed her toward his police car, Sarah saw another police cruiser pull up. Officer Jenny Rodriguez stepped out, looking confused at the scene. "Everything okay here, Mitchell?" Rodriguez asked, clearly uncomfortable. "Just another drunk driver giving me attitude," Mitchell said loudly. "Call a tow truck for her car." Sarah looked directly at Rodriguez. "Officer, I need to report misconduct. Officer Mitchell is making an illegal arrest. I'd like to speak to the watch commander." Mitchell pushed Sarah into the back of his car before Rodriguez could respond. "Save it for the judge," he sneered, slamming the door. Through the window, Sarah watched Rodriguez stand uncertainly by her car. The young officer took out her phone, probably sensing something wasn't right. But Mitchell was already getting into the driver's seat, a satisfied smile on his face. As they drove toward the police station, Sarah stayed calm. She thought about the files on her desk, all the other people Mitchell had treated this way. She thought about her husband, David, who was probably giving his speech at the conference right now. And she thought about how this arrest was about to change everything in Millbrook. Mitchell had no idea he'd just arrested the captain's wife, but he was going to find out soon enough. The fluorescent lights at the Millbrook police station buzzed overhead as Officer Mitchell led Sarah through the booking area. Other officers looked up from their desks, some with surprise at seeing a well-dressed woman in handcuffs. Sarah held her head high, her heels clicking against the floor tiles. "Sit there and don't move," Mitchell ordered, pointing to a hard plastic chair near the booking desk. He was enjoying this moment, taking his time with the paperwork while Sarah sat handcuffed. Sergeant Pete Collins walked over to Mitchell's desk. "What's the charge?" he asked, glancing at Sarah. "Drunk driving and resisting arrest," Mitchell replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She was giving me attitude during the stop. You know how these people are." Collins looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. He'd known Mitchell for years and had seen this pattern before, but something felt different this time. The woman didn't look drunk at all. "I want my phone call," Sarah said calmly, "and I'd like to report misconduct by Officer Mitchell." Mitchell laughed. "Phone calls are a privilege, not a right. You'll get it when I'm ready." This was another lie. Phone calls were absolutely a right, and Sarah knew it. Officer Rodriguez walked in, carrying Sarah's purse and phone from her car. She placed them on the booking desk, then hesitated. "Mitchell, can I talk to you for a minute?" Later, he dismissed her with a wave. "I'm busy teaching someone about respect for law enforcement." Sarah watched as Rodriguez walked away, then turned to speak to another officer in the corner. The young officer was doing the right thing, documenting everything she saw. Sarah made a mental note to remember that for later. Time passed slowly. Mitchell deliberately took over an hour just to start the booking paperwork, hoping to break Sarah's calm demeanor. But Sarah sat quietly, watching everything and everyone. She noticed how other officers kept looking at her with concern, how they whispered to each other, how some made phone calls and quickly hung up. "Stand up," Mitchell finally ordered. "Time for your mugshot." Sarah stood gracefully despite the handcuffs. "Officer Mitchell, you still haven't read me my rights or allowed me my phone call. Everything you're doing is being noted." Mitchell's face turned red again. "Turn to the right," he snapped, ignoring her words. "Now the left." After the mugshot, Mitchell started the fingerprinting process, pressing each of Sarah's fingers roughly against the scanner. He was so focused on trying to make her uncomfortable that he didn't notice the growing unease in the station. Officer Rodriguez had made several calls by now. So had Sergeant Collins. The watch commander, Lieutenant Garcia, had been notified and was on his way in. Something about this arrest didn't feel right to any of them. "Where's Captain Wilson?" One rookie officer whispered to another. "You should know about this." "At that conference in the Capitol," came the reply. "Won't be back until tomorrow." Sarah heard these whispers and kept her composure. She knew David's phone would be off during his presentation. She knew he wouldn't see any messages until later. But she also knew that when he did, everything would change. Mitchell finally finished the paperwork, making sure to list every possible charge he could think of. "Hope you're comfortable." He smirked at Sarah. "You'll be here all weekend. Judge won't be available until Monday." "That's incorrect," Sarah replied calmly. "There's a duty judge available 24/7 for probable cause hearings, as you well know." Mitchell's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't expected her to know that. "Well, look who knows so much about the law. Too bad it won't help you here." Just then, Lieutenant Garcia walked in. He took one look at Sarah and his face went pale. He knew exactly who she was. He'd been at her and David's wedding 3 years ago. "Mitchell," Garcia called out sharply. "My office. Now." "In a minute, sir," Mitchell replied, still focused on making Sarah uncomfortable. "Just finishing up here." "Now, Mitchell." Garcia's voice left no room for argument. As Mitchell walked toward the lieutenant's office, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The first cracks in Mitchell's armor were starting to show. Soon, they would break wide open. Captain David Wilson stood at the podium, finishing his presentation about community policing at the state conference. As soon as he stepped off the stage, he turned his phone back on. Immediately, it buzzed with dozens of missed calls and messages. "Sir," a young officer from his department ran up to him. "We've been trying to reach you for hours." David's heart stopped when he read the first message. His wife Sarah had been arrested. By James Mitchell. Without saying another word, he grabbed his coat and ran for his car. Back at the Millbrook police station, Mitchell sat in Lieutenant Garcia's office, defending his actions. She was drunk, resisting arrest. "Stop talking," Garcia interrupted. "Just stop. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "My job," Mitchell said firmly. "I don't care if she's some hotshot lawyer. The law applies to everyone." Garcia rubbed his temples. "Mitchell, that woman you arrested. That's Sarah Lawrence Wilson, Captain Wilson's wife." The color drained from Mitchell's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in his 15-year career, Officer James Mitchell felt real fear. Out in the booking area, things were changing quickly. Sergeant Collins had already removed Sarah's handcuffs and brought her a cup of water. Officer Rodriguez sat with her, taking detailed notes about everything that had happened. "Mrs. Wilson," Collins said nervously, "we can release you right now. No charges." Sarah shook her head. "No, I want everything processed properly. Every illegal action Officer Mitchell took needs to be documented. This isn't just about me." The station doors burst open. Captain David Wilson walked in, still wearing his conference lanyard. His face was dark with anger. Every officer in the room stood up straight. "Where is she?" David's voice was calm, but everyone could hear the fury beneath it. "David!" Sarah stood up, and her husband rushed to embrace her. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" David checked her wrists where the handcuffs had been. "I'm fine," Sarah assured him, "but we need to talk about Officer Mitchell. This isn't the first time he's done this. It's just the first time he did it to someone who could fight back." David nodded, his jaw tight. "Where is he?" "In my office," Garcia answered, with his union rep on the way. David turned to address the room. "I want everything documented. Body cam footage, booking photos, paperwork. Every single thing Mitchell did tonight. No one goes home until it's done." Officers scrambled to comply. They all knew this was a turning point. Mitchell sat in Garcia's office, sweating. Through the window, he could see Captain Wilson holding his wife, the same woman Mitchell had treated so badly just hours ago, the same woman he had arrested for no reason except. Mitchell felt sick. For the first time, he saw himself through others' eyes. He saw every traffic stop, every false arrest, every time he'd abused his power. But this time, he couldn't hide behind his badge. The door opened. Captain Wilson walked in, his face unreadable. Mitchell jumped to his feet. "Captain, I can explain." "Sit down." David's voice could have frozen fire. "The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is that my wife insisted we follow proper procedures. The procedures you ignored when arresting her." Mitchell sat, his legs shaking. "I didn't know she was your wife." "That's the problem, isn't it?" David's voice was quiet but intense. "You thought she was just another black woman you could bully. Someone without power. Someone who couldn't fight back. You've been doing this for years, Mitchell. But it ends tonight." "Please," Mitchell whispered. "I have a family, a mortgage." "So do all the people you've arrested illegally," David replied. "Internal Affairs will be here in an hour. I suggest you think very carefully about every racist thing you've done wearing that badge, because by the time we're done, you won't have it anymore." As David walked out, Mitchell slumped in his chair. Through the window, he watched Sarah talking to Officer Rodriguez, probably building the case that would end his career. His phone buzzed, his union rep telling him not to say another word. But Mitchell knew it was too late. His badge wouldn't protect him anymore. His house of cards was finally falling down. The next morning, the Millbrook police station was buzzing with activity. 2 internal affairs investigators, Roberts and Chen, had taken over the conference room. They sat at the long table, surrounded by files, computers, and coffee cups. "Play the body camera footage again," Roberts said, leaning forward in his chair. On the screen, they watched Mitchell's traffic stop of Sarah for the 10th time. Every lie, every violation of procedure was clear as day. Jen took notes on her laptop. No probable cause for the stop. No field sobriety test procedures followed. Illegal arrest. Denial of rights during booking. She looked up at her partner. "And that's just from last night." Captain Wilson had stepped aside from the investigation, knowing he couldn't be involved. But before he did, he made sure the investigators had everything they needed. "Check every traffic stop Mitchell made in the last 5 years," he had told them. "Every arrest, every complaint." Sarah sat in her office downtown, her phone ringing constantly. Word had gotten out about Mitchell's arrest of the captain's wife, and people wanted to tell their stories. Her assistant worked quickly to schedule appointments with everyone who called. "Another one," her assistant said, sticking her head in the door. "James Mitchell gave this man a false drug charge last year. Lost his job because of it. Cases got dismissed, but the damage was done." Sarah nodded, adding the information to her growing file. She had been building this case against Mitchell for months, but now people weren't afraid to speak up anymore. The wall of silence was breaking down. Back at the station, Officer Rodriguez sat with the investigators, sharing everything she had seen. "It wasn't just last night," she explained. "Mitchell had a pattern. He targeted people of color, made up reasons to stop them. Some of us tried to report it, but nothing ever happened." Roberts pulled up Mitchell's personnel file on his computer. "Look at this. 27 complaints in 15 years, all marked as unfounded or resolved without action." He shook his head. Someone was protecting him. Chen was going through Mitchell's traffic stop data. In the last year alone, 85% of his arrests were minorities. in a town that's only 30% minority population. She made another note. This isn't just a few bad stops, this is systematic discrimination. In another room, Sergeant Collins nervously gave his statement. Yes, I knew what Mitchell was doing, he admitted. We all did. But he had friends in high places. Anyone who spoke up got shut down. Names, Roberts demanded. We need names. As Collins started talking, more officers came forward. They had stayed quiet for years, afraid of retaliation. But now, with internal affairs involved and the captain's wife building a civil rights case, the truth was pouring out. Mitchell sat in his home, suspended without pay. His phone had been ringing too. Other officers who had covered for him over the years, now wanting to save themselves. His union representative had already told him the best he could hope for was a resignation deal. Criminal charges were coming. Sarah met with David for lunch at a small cafe away from both their offices. How many victims so far? He asked. 43, Sarah replied, pushing her salad around her plate. And more coming forward every hour. Mitchell ruined lives, David. People lost jobs, homes, families because of his false arrests. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And now they'll get justice. Because of you. Because he finally arrested someone he couldn't intimidate, Sarah corrected. But this isn't just about Mitchell. The whole system that protected him needs to change. Back in the conference room, Roberts and Chen added another stack of files to their collection. Mitchell's case was expanding beyond just one racist officer. They were finding other problems, other officers who had helped cover up misconduct. This is going to be big, Chen said, looking at the growing mountain of evidence. Career-ending big. Roberts nodded, reaching for more coffee. Good. Sometimes the whole tree needs to come down, not just one bad apple. Outside the station, news vans were starting to arrive. The story of how a racist cop's false arrest of the captain's wife had exposed years of systematic discrimination was too big to ignore. Change was coming to Millbrook, whether the old guard was ready or not. 1 week after Sarah's arrest, Mitchell sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the papers spread across the desk. Each page showed another piece of evidence against him, his body camera footage, his arrest records, his text messages with other officers about targeting minority drivers. It's bad, his lawyer said plainly. The district attorney is filing criminal charges. Multiple counts of civil rights violations, false arrest, abuse of power. He slid another paper across the desk. And that's just the criminal side. Mrs. Wilson is filing a class action lawsuit with 48 other victims. Mitchell wiped sweat from his forehead. What are my options? Not many, the lawyer replied. The police union has dropped you. Your former friends at the department are all making deals to save themselves. The best I can do is negotiate a plea bargain. Outside the lawyer's office, the story had exploded. Local news stations camped outside the police station, interviewing people who had been targeted by Mitchell over the years. Their stories were heartbreaking. He arrested my son on fake charges, one mother told the cameras, crying. My boy lost his college scholarship because of it. Now Officer Mitchell is finally getting what he deserves. Sarah worked late into the night, preparing the civil lawsuit. She had gathered statements from dozens of victims, showing how Mitchell's actions had damaged their lives. Lost jobs, broken families, destroyed reputations. Each story made her more determined to see justice done. David faced his own challenges at the police department. Some officers were angry about Mitchell's arrest, saying Sarah had played the race card to get him in trouble, but most supported the changes David was making. We're installing new dashboard cameras in all patrol cars, he announced at a staff meeting. Body cameras stay on during every interaction. No more convenient technical problems during traffic stops. Officer Rodriguez had become a key witness. She sat with internal affairs for hours, explaining how Mitchell and his friends had pressured younger officers to stay quiet about misconduct. He told us this was how real police work was done, she testified. If we complained, we were labeled as troublemakers. Some good officers quit because of it. Mitchell's former friends abandoned him quickly. Sergeant Collins made a deal to retire early in exchange for his testimony. 2 other officers were suspended for helping cover up Mitchell's false arrests. The old system of protection was crumbling. The district attorney called a press conference. Today, "We are filing criminal charges against former Officer James Mitchell," she announced to the crowd of reporters. "This case reveals a disturbing pattern of racist behavior and abuse of power. We will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law." In his home, Mitchell watched the press conference on TV. His wife had taken their kids to stay with her parents. His neighbors avoided him. 15 years of power and privilege were gone in just 1 week. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer, DA offering a deal. 5 years prison time, must testify against others involved. Let me know ASAP. Mitchell's hands shook as he read the message. Prison. The word he had used to threaten so many innocent people was now hanging over his own head. At the police station, David hung a new poster in the break room. It showed the department's updated mission statement: to protect and serve ALO citizens with equal respect and dignity. Below it, he added a confidential tip line number for reporting officer misconduct. Sarah met with more victims in her office. "This lawsuit isn't just about money," she explained to them. "It's about changing the system, making sure this never happens to anyone else." They nodded, many of them crying. For years, they have felt powerless against Mitchell's badge. Now they were finally being heard. The sun set over Millbrook, but lights still burned in offices across town. Lawyers prepared court documents. Investigators reviewed evidence. Journalists wrote stories. Mitchell's arrest of Sarah had cracked open something much bigger than one racist cop. Change was happening, file by file, statement by statement, truth by truth. The reckoning had come to Millbrook, and nothing would be the same again. The courthouse was packed on the first day of Mitchell's trial. News cameras lined the steps outside, and every seat in the courtroom was filled. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit that seemed too big for him now. He had lost weight during the 3 months since Sarah's arrest. District Attorney Maria Santos stood before the jury. "This case is about power and racism," she began. "About a police officer who thought his badge gave him the right to destroy lives. We will show you evidence of dozens of illegal arrests, all targeting people of color." Mitchell's lawyer tried to paint a different picture. "My client is a dedicated officer with 15 years of service," he argued. "One incident is being used to smear his entire career." But the evidence told the real story. Day after day, witnesses came forward to testify about Mitchell's actions. A young college student spoke about missing finals because of a false arrest. "He planted drugs in my car," the student testified. "I lost my scholarship. Had to drop out. All because I was black and driving a nice car." A grandmother told the jury about being handcuffed in front of her grandchildren. "He said I ran a stop sign. There wasn't even a stop sign on that street, but he knew nobody would believe me over a police officer." Officer Rodriguez testified about the culture of silence Mitchell had created. "He taught rookie officers that this was normal police work," she explained. "If we reported him, our careers would be over." Sarah's testimony was the most powerful. She sat in the witness stand, calm and professional, and described every detail of her arrest: the illegal stop, the false accusations, the denial of her rights. "Officer Mitchell didn't know I was the captain's wife," she told the jury. "He didn't know I was a lawyer. He saw only one thing, the color of my skin, and he thought that meant he could abuse his power without consequences." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Sarah played the recording from her phone. His voice filled the courtroom, dripping with contempt as he arrested her without cause. The prosecution showed charts of Mitchell's arrest records. 85% of his arrests were minorities, Santos explained to the jury. In a town that's less than 30% minority population, these numbers tell a clear story of targeted racism. Former Sergeant Collins testified as part of his deal. "Yes, we covered up complaints against him," he admitted. "Yes, we knew it was wrong. We were part of a system that protected bad officers instead of the public." Mitchell's lawyer tried to challenge each witness, but the evidence was too strong. Body camera footage, arrest records, text messages. The truth was impossible to deny. On the 10th day of the trial, Mitchell finally took the stand. His voice shook as he tried to defend himself. "I was just doing my job," he insisted. "Fighting crime, keeping the streets safe." "Safe for who?" Santos asked during cross-examination. "Safe for the black student who lost his future? Safe for the grandmother humiliated in front of her grandchildren? Safe for Mrs. Wilson, Were you arrested for being black in her own neighborhood? Mitchell had no answer. He stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. In the gallery, David sat with Sarah every day, watching justice being done. Other police officers came to support them, wearing new pins that read, "Protect and serve everyone." The jury took only 4 hours to reach their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of power under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. Mitchell slumped in his chair as the verdicts continued. Each guilty was another nail in the coffin of his career, his freedom, and the corrupt system he had represented. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with other victims, holding hands as they faced the cameras. "This verdict sends a message," she told reporters. "A badge is not a license for racism. Power comes with responsibility, and justice, though delayed, will come for those who abuse that power." The sun was setting over Millbrook as Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, the same way he had led away so many innocent people. But this time, the handcuffs served justice instead of racism. 1 year after Mitchell's conviction, the Millbrook Police Department looked very different. Captain David Wilson, now promoted to Chief Wilson, stood in front of the new Community Oversight Board. The room was filled with citizens from all parts of town, coming together to make their police department better. "Our arrests are down 40%, David reported. But our community trust is up. Every officer now gets extensive bias training. Body cameras stay on. And most importantly, every complaint is investigated fully." Sarah sat in the audience, smiling proudly at her husband. The class action lawsuit she had led against the department had ended in a $5 million settlement for Mitchell's victims. But money wasn't the most important change. "The settlement requires complete reform," she explained to a group of law students who now interned at her office. "New hiring practices, regular audits of traffic stops and arrests, a citizen review board with real power. We're making sure no other officer can do what Mitchell did." Mitchell himself sat in a prison cell, serving his 7-year sentence. His wife had divorced him, and most of his former friends pretended they had never known him. Late at night, he read letters from people whose lives he had damaged, part of his required restorative justice program. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to Sergeant Rodriguez, led the department's new community outreach program. She visited schools and community centers, building trust between police and citizens. "When I was a rookie, Mitchell taught us that good police work meant making lots of arrests," she told a group of new officers. "Now we know that good police work means protecting everyone's rights, building trust, serving all citizens equally." The young college student who had lost his scholarship because of Mitchell's false arrest was back in school. The settlement money had allowed him to return to his studies. He was now majoring in criminal justice, planning to become a civil rights lawyer like Sarah. "She showed me that the law can be a force for good," he told his classmates. "That justice is possible if we fight for it." In the police station break room, a new poster hung where Mitchell's arrest photos used to be. It showed faces of all colors, with words that read, "To protect and serve means to protect and serve EVERYONE." Below it was a plaque listing the names of officers who had received commendations for community service. Sarah's law practice had grown. She now led a team of lawyers specializing in civil rights cases. People came from other cities to learn from what had happened in Millbrook. "One bad officer didn't create the problem," she explained at a law conference. "A whole system allowed that officer to abuse power for years. Changing the system is harder than removing one person, but it's the only way to create real justice." David brought changes to every level of the department: regular mental health checkups for officers, community feedback sessions, anonymous tip line for reporting misconduct that was actually investigated. The old guard who had protected Mitchell were gone, replaced by officers who believed in equal justice. "My wife's arrest was painful," he told a newspaper reporter, "but sometimes it takes pain to bring healing. What Mitchell did to her, he had done to countless others who couldn't fight back. Now nobody in our department can do that again." The grandmother who had been handcuffed in front of her grandchildren now served on the Citizen Oversight Board. Her grandchildren attended police athletic league events, no longer afraid of officers. "Things aren't perfect," she said at a board meeting. "Change takes time, but at least now we have a voice. At least now we have hope. One evening, Sarah and David walked through their neighborhood, holding hands. A police car drove past, and the officer waved friendly at them. Sarah waved back, no longer tense at the sight of flashing lights. "Do you think Mitchell learned anything?" David asked quietly. Sarah thought for a moment. Maybe, maybe not. But the important thing is that the system learned. The department learned. The city learned. And now we're teaching others. They stopped to watch the sunset over Millbrook. The city wasn't perfect, but it was better. What had started with one racist traffic stop had led to real change. Because one woman was strong enough to stand up, brave enough to fight back, and determined enough to turn her pain into progress. Justice had come to Millbrook, not just for Sarah, but for everyone. The autumn evening was growing darker as Judge Marcus Thompson's black BMW glided smoothly along Cedar Street. The street lights had just begun to flicker on, casting long shadows across the clean, well-maintained suburban roads. It had been another long day at the federal courthouse, and the 52-year-old judge was looking forward to getting home to his family. Marcus had spent 15 years building his reputation as one of the city's most respected federal judges. His silver-rimmed glasses and neatly pressed dark suit reflected his careful attention to detail, a trait that had served him well throughout his career. Tonight, his suit jacket lay carefully draped across the back seat, his tie loosened just slightly after 12 hours of hearing cases. In his rearview mirror, Marcus noticed the white and blue police cruiser that had been following him for the past 6 blocks. He checked his speedometer, exactly at the speed limit. His hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. Even after all these years, even in his position, he knew what it meant to be a black man driving an expensive car in this neighborhood after dark. Officer James Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his eyes fixed on the BMW ahead. At 34, he had 8 years on the force and a reputation that followed him, though not one he saw as problematic. His supervisor had warned him about his high number of traffic stops involving minorities, but Reynolds always defended his record with the same response. "I don't see color, I see suspicious behavior." The BMW's brake lights glowed red at a stop sign, and Reynolds watched as the driver made a complete, proper stop. Still, something about the car didn't sit right with him. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where he usually saw black drivers, especially not at this hour. His finger hovered over the light bar control. Marcus felt his heart sink as the red and blue lights suddenly erupted behind him. He'd done nothing wrong, he was sure of it. Carefully, he activated his dashboard camera, a habit he'd developed years ago. As he pulled over to the curb, he also took out his phone and placed it on the passenger seat, making sure its camera was also recording. Following the procedure he'd learned long ago and had to use far too many times, Marcus turned on his interior lights, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The cool night air drifted in through the open window as he waited, watching in his side mirror as Officer Reynolds approached. The beam of a flashlight swept across his side mirror, temporarily blinding him. Marcus could make out Reynolds's figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a military-style haircut and a stern expression that seemed carved from stone. The officer's right hand rested near his holster, a detail that didn't escape Marcus's notice. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, his flashlight beam now directly on Marcus's face. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus kept his voice steady and calm, despite the familiar anger and humiliation burning in his chest. "Good evening, officer. I live in this neighborhood. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Reynolds's face hardened. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration now." With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus reached for his glove compartment. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my documents now. They're in my glove box." He narrated each movement, knowing from both personal experience and professional knowledge how quickly these situations could escalate. As he handed over his license and registration, Marcus noticed a flicker of something cross Reynolds's face as the beam of the flashlight illuminated his credentials. Federal judges didn't usually get pulled over for random traffic stops. "Sir, I still haven't been informed of the reason for this stop," Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used in his courtroom. "Could you please tell me what traffic violation you observed?" Reynolds stood straighter, his jaw tightening. The comfortable authority he usually felt during traffic stops was slipping away, replaced by a growing realization that he might have made a serious mistake. He glanced down at the license again, then back at Marcus, the weight of what he'd done beginning to settle on his shoulders. The night air grew heavier with tension as both men realized this wouldn't be just another traffic stop. For Marcus, it was an all too familiar reminder that his position and success didn't shield him from prejudice. For Reynolds, though he didn't know it yet, it was about to become a moment that would force him to confront truths he'd spent years denying. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to another, the silence growing uncomfortable as he stared at Judge Thompson's credentials. The gold federal judge badge gleamed under his flashlight beam, seeming to mock his authority. His mind raced to find a legitimate reason for the stop, but he knew he had none. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds finally commanded, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice carried less authority now, but old habits died hard. Marcus Thompson took a slow, deep breath. In his years on the bench, he had seen countless cases where routine traffic stops escalated into tragedy. He pressed the record button on his phone's camera app again, ensuring it was still capturing everything. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus spoke clearly, making sure his voice would be picked up by both recording devices. "I respectfully decline to exit my vehicle unless you can provide me with a legitimate reason for this traffic stop. As you can see from my credentials, I am a federal judge, and I know my rights under the law." Reynolds's face flushed red in the darkness. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. In his 8 years on the force, no one had ever so calmly and professionally challenged his authority. Most people either got angry and defensive or became submissive out of fear. "Sir, I observed your vehicle driving erratically," Reynolds lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He knew his dashcam would prove otherwise, but he felt trapped in a corner of his own making. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining neutral. "Officer, I know your patrol car is equipped with a dashboard camera. So is my vehicle. Additionally, I've been recording this interaction on my phone. Would you like to revise that statement?" A young couple walking their dog passed by slowly, their curious eyes taking in the scene. Reynolds felt exposed, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the judge's calm scrutiny. His hand, which had been resting near his weapon, fell limply to his side. Reynolds started, then stopped. For the first time in his career, he found himself at a complete loss for words. Marcus decided to shift the dynamic. In his courtroom, he had learned that moments of high tension often presented the best opportunities for teaching. "Officer Reynolds, what's your badge number and the name of your supervising officer?" Reynolds straightened up automatically. "Badge number 47,831, sir. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez is my supervising officer." "Thank you," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. He opened his contacts and began typing, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Lieutenant Martinez and I served together on the city's police oversight committee. I'm sending her a message right now." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. This traffic stop was quickly becoming a career-defining moment, and not in the way he'd hoped. His mind flashed to his mortgage, his kids' school fees, and his wife's face when he'd tell her he'd lost his job. But Judge Thompson had different plans. However, he continued, looking directly at Reynolds, "I believe this could be an opportunity for something more constructive than a formal complaint." Reynolds blinked in surprise. The judge's tone had shifted from confrontational to contemplative. "Tomorrow morning, I'm presiding over several cases involving police conduct and racial profiling," Marcus explained, his voice taking on the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. "I'd like you to observe these proceedings, Officer Reynolds. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity for perspective." The unexpected offer hung in the night air between them. Reynolds stood frozen, processing the words. He had been bracing for career-ending consequences, not an invitation to court. "Sir, Reynolds paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Are you saying you're not going to file a complaint?" Marcus leaned slightly out of his window, making direct eye contact with the officer. "I've seen enough careers ended over mistakes, Officer Reynolds. What I haven't seen enough of is growth and change. The choice is yours. You can face disciplinary action, or you can take this opportunity to understand why moments like this matter so much." Reynolds lowered his flashlight completely. finally seeing Judge Thompson clearly in the soft glow of the street lights. The man before him wasn't angry or vengeful, he was offering a chance at redemption. Court starts at 9 a.m., Marcus continued, his tone firm but not unkind. I trust you can find your way to courtroom 304 without a GPS. The small attempt at humor wasn't lost on Reynolds, who managed a slight, embarrassed smile. Yes, Your Honor. I'll be there. As Marcus drove away a few minutes later, both men knew that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a significant change, not just for Officer Reynolds, but potentially for the entire department. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost mocking to Officer James Reynolds. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his uniform for the 5th time. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of a sleepless night spent replaying yesterday's traffic stop in his mind. His wife, Maria, watched him from the doorway with concern. James, you've been quiet since you got home last night. What happened during your shift? Reynolds turned to face her, his shoulders heavy. I messed up, Maria. I pulled over a federal judge because... He couldn't finish the sentence. The truth stuck in his throat. Because he was black? Maria finished softly. She worried about this day coming, had seen the gradual changes in her husband over his years on the force. At 8:45 a.m., Reynolds walked through the courthouse security checkpoint. Several other officers nodded at him, probably assuming he was there to testify in a case, if they only knew. The marble halls felt longer than usual as he made his way to courtroom 304. Inside, Judge Thompson was already at his bench, reviewing documents for the day's proceedings. He looked up as Reynolds entered, acknowledging him with a subtle nod. Officer Reynolds, please take a seat in the front row. The courtroom was filling up with lawyers, defendants, and other observers. Reynolds noticed he wasn't the only police officer present. Several others sat scattered throughout the room, some in uniform, others in plain clothes, but he suspected he was the only one there for a lesson in humility. The first case called involved a young black man who had been arrested for suspicious behavior while waiting for a bus. The arresting officer, a veteran with 20 years on the force, testified with complete confidence about his reasonable suspicion. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he recognized his own justifications in the officer's words. Judge Thompson listened patiently, his expression neutral. When the officer finished, the judge removed his glasses and leaned forward. Officer Parker, could you please explain to this court what specific behaviors led to your suspicion? The veteran officer's certainty began to crack under the judge's careful questioning. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the arrest had been based on nothing more than the young man's race and presence in an affluent neighborhood. Reynolds felt his face grow hot as he recognized the parallel to his own actions. Case after case followed, each one peeling back layers of systemic bias in law enforcement. Reynolds watched as Judge Thompson handled each situation with remarkable patience and fairness, never showing anger, but never letting injustice slide either. During a brief recess, Judge Thompson beckoned Reynolds to approach the bench. The courtroom had emptied except for the bailiff, who maintained a discreet distance. What are your observations so far, Officer Reynolds? The judge asked, his tone genuinely curious. Reynolds stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back. Your Honor, he paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm seeing patterns I didn't want to acknowledge before. When that last officer testified about his gut feelings about suspicious behavior, I heard myself. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. It's not easy to confront our own biases, is it? No, sir, Reynolds admitted. I always told myself I was just being a good cop, following my instincts. But seeing it from this side, he gestured at the courtroom around them. Let me share something with you, Judge Thompson said, leaning forward. 25 years ago, before I wore this robe, I was pulled over 3 times in 1 month in my own neighborhood. Each time, the officer claimed it was routine. Each time, I had to prove I belonged in my own community. Reynolds felt the weight of shame pressing down on his shoulders. I never thought about it that way, Your Honor. When I pulled you over last night, you saw what you expected to see. Judge Thompson finished. But here's what matters now, Officer Reynolds. What will you see tomorrow? The question hung in the air between them. Through the courtroom windows, Reynolds could see other police officers arriving for the afternoon session, their badges catching the sunlight. Each one carried the same power he did, the same responsibility, and, he now realized, the same potential for both harm and good. "I'd like to learn to see things differently," Reynolds said finally, his voice firm with newfound conviction. "Not just for today, but for every traffic stop, every interaction." Judge Thompson smiled for the first time that day. "Then perhaps last night's unfortunate encounter will serve a greater purpose than either of us initially imagined." 1 year after the traffic stop that changed 2 lives, Judge Marcus Thompson stood at a podium in the City Hall's main conference room. The room was packed with police officers, community leaders, journalists, and citizens. Officer James Reynolds sat in the front row, his wife Maria beside him, both beaming with pride. "Today, we're not just launching a program," Judge Thompson began, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "We're starting a movement that we call Breach the Gap. What began as a traffic stop has grown into something none of us could have imagined." On the screen behind him, statistics told a powerful story. In the past year, their police department had seen a 70% reduction in complaints about racial profiling. Traffic stop data showed more balanced enforcement across all neighborhoods, but more importantly, community trust was growing. Reynolds thought back to the changes he witnessed over the past year. His training program had spread beyond their department. 5 other cities had already adopted it, but the real success stories were in the small, daily interactions that would never make the news. Last week, he watched one of his trained officers handle a situation that could have gone badly wrong. A teenage boy had been reported for suspicious behavior outside a convenience store. Instead of rushing in with assumptions, the officer had approached calmly, learned the boy was waiting for his mother who worked inside, and ended up helping him with his math homework while he waited. Judge Thompson continued his speech. "Officer Reynolds and I could have let that night end differently. I could have filed a complaint. He could have remained defensive. Instead, we chose to build something together." The judge gestured to a group of young officers in the audience. "These 20 officers are our first official class of Breach the Gap mentors. They'll work with community members to create understanding where there was fear, dialogue where there was silence." Reynolds smiled at the young officers. He had personally trained each one, sharing not just techniques but his own story of transformation. Among them was Officer Chen, who had gone from rookie to one of the program's strongest advocates. Maria squeezed her husband's hand as Judge Thompson began describing the program's next phase. They both knew how much work had gone into this moment. Late nights reviewing training materials, weekend community meetings, countless conversations with officers resistant to change. But it had all been worth it. "Our children deserve a world where they're not afraid of those sworn to protect them," Judge Thompson continued. "Our officers deserve the tools and training to serve without the burden of unconscious bias. Our communities deserve the chance to trust again." The new initiatives were ambitious: regular community dialogue sessions, ride-along programs for citizens, implicit bias training starting at the police academy level, and monthly meetings where officers could share their challenges and successes openly. After the presentation, people mingled in small groups, sharing stories and ideas. Reynolds watched as his teenage son talked animatedly with a black student from the youth advisory board they'd created. A year ago, these conversations wouldn't have seemed possible. Later that evening, Reynolds and Judge Thompson stood in the parking lot, just like they had a year ago, but under very different circumstances. "Did you ever imagine this?" Reynolds asked, looking back at the building where people were still talking and planning. Judge Thompson smiled. "Actually, I did. The moment you agreed to come to my courtroom that first day, I knew there was hope. Real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding." Reynolds nodded, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by their work. "You know what my daughter said yesterday? She told me she's proud to tell her friends I'm a police officer. A year ago, she was worried about what her black friends would think." "That's the real measure of success," Judge Thompson replied, "when our children can see the change we're creating." As they prepared to leave, a young black officer approached them. "Sir," he addressed Reynolds, "I just wanted to say, your story inspired me to join the force. I wanted to be part of this change." Reynolds felt his throat tighten with emotion. He remembered Judge Thompson's words from a year ago about Officer Miller, a man who had changed his life decades earlier. Now he understood what it meant to be part of that legacy. "The work isn't finished," Judge Thompson said, looking at both men. but every step forward makes the next one easier. The afternoon session of court had just ended when Judge Thompson invited Officer Reynolds to his chambers. The wood-paneled room felt warm and intimidating at the same time, with walls lined with law books and framed photographs showing the judge with various community leaders and presidents. Reynolds sat in a leather chair across from the judge's desk, his police cap held nervously in his hands. The events of the day had left him mentally exhausted, but somehow more awake than ever to things he'd been blind to before. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Thompson began, settling into his chair, "I saw you taking notes during today's proceedings. Would you share your thoughts?" Reynolds pulled out his small notepad, his handwriting messier than usual due to his shaking hands. "Your Honor, I counted 17 cases today. In 12 of them, the arrests were made based on what officers called suspicious behavior. But when you asked for specific details," he paused, swallowing hard. "Most of us couldn't give any real reason except that the person looked out of place." Judge Thompson nodded, pleased at the officer's observation. "And what does out of place usually mean in these situations?" "Being black or Hispanic in a wealthy neighborhood," Reynolds admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. "Just like when I stopped you last night." The judge leaned forward, placing his elbows on his desk. "Officer Reynolds, I'm going to make you an unusual proposal. Lieutenant Martinez and I discussed your situation this morning. Instead of filing a formal complaint, I have something else in mind." Reynolds sat up straighter, hope mixing with anxiety in his chest. "I want you to spend the next month working with me on a special project," Judge Thompson continued. 3 days a week, you'll observe different courtrooms handling cases involving police interactions. But here's the real challenge. I want you to help create a training program for other officers based on what you learn." Reynolds blinked in surprise. "A training program, sir?" "Yes. You see, filing a complaint against you might satisfy some need for punishment, but it wouldn't create change. You're not the first officer to make these mistakes, and you won't be the last unless we do something to break the cycle." Through the office window, Reynolds could see the sun setting over the city skyline. The same streets he patrolled for 8 years suddenly looked different to him. How many times had he made assumptions? How many lives had he impacted without even realizing it? "But why me, Your Honor?" Reynolds asked. "After what I did, why would you trust me with something this important?" Judge Thompson smiled, reaching for a framed photo on his desk. He handed it to Reynolds, who saw a younger version of the judge standing next to an older white police officer. "That's Officer Frank Miller," the judge explained. 30 years ago, he pulled me over for the same reason you did, driving while black. But instead of writing me a ticket or making excuses, he admitted his mistake. Then he spent the next 20 years working to change the department from within. He became my mentor, my friend, and eventually, best man at my wedding." Reynolds studied the photo, seeing the genuine friendship between the two men. "What happened to him?" "He retired 5 years ago, but his legacy lives on in the officers he trained. Sometimes, Officer Reynolds, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for change. The question is, are you willing to take on this challenge?" Reynolds looked at the photo again, then back at the judge. In the past 24 hours, his world had been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about being a good police officer had been challenged. But instead of feeling defensive or angry, he felt something else: hope. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly. "I want to be part of the solution." Judge Thompson extended his hand across the desk. "Then let's begin. Tomorrow, you'll start by reviewing body camera footage from traffic stops across the department. We'll analyze patterns, identify triggers, and develop strategies for better decision-making." As they shook hands, both men understood that this was more than just a training program. It was a chance to bridge gaps, challenge assumptions, and create real change in their community. For Reynolds, it was the beginning of a journey that would reshape not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. 1 week into his special assignment, Officer Reynolds sat in courtroom 304 with a fresh perspective. Today was different from his previous observations. He wasn't just watching cases, he was taking an active role in analyzing police testimony. His notebook was already half full of observations, and the morning session hadn't even ended. The case before Judge Thompson involved a teenager named Marcus Johnson, arrested for resisting arrest during what should have been a routine jaywalking stop. The arresting officer, a rookie named Peterson, stood at the witness stand, confidently describing the incident. The suspect displayed aggressive behavior when approached. Officer Peterson testified, his chin held high. He reached for his waistband, and I feared for my safety. Reynolds watched as Judge Thompson reviewed the body camera footage on the courtroom screen. The video told a different story. It showed a scared 16-year-old boy reaching for his school ID, his hands shaking as he tried to explain he was late for his SAT prep class. Officer Peterson, Judge Thompson spoke calmly, posing the video. Could you point out the aggressive behavior you mentioned? The young officer's confidence wavered. Reynolds felt a familiar discomfort as he recognized the same mistakes he had made countless times, seeing threat where there was only fear, assuming guilt where there was only confusion. During the lunch break, Reynolds sat in the courthouse cafeteria, pushing his sandwich around his plate. An older black woman approached his table, her eyes red from crying. "You're one of the police officers, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Reynolds nodded, noticing she was clutching a tissue. "Yes, ma'am. Is everything all right?" "I just wanted to thank you," she said, surprising him. "I was in court this morning. I saw you shaking your head during that young officer's testimony about Marcus. That's my grandson." Reynolds felt his throat tighten. "Please, sit down," he'd offered, pulling out a chair. "Marcus is a good boy," she continued, sitting down heavily. "Honor roll student, never been in trouble. But ever since that arrest, he's been having nightmares. He doesn't want to walk to school anymore." Reynolds thought about his own children at home, trying to imagine them being afraid to walk down their own street. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about what happened to your grandson. I'm here because I'm learning to be a better officer, to help prevent things like this from happening." The grandmother smiled sadly. "It's not just about being better officers. It's about seeing us as people first. Not suspects, not statistics, just people trying to live our lives like everyone else." Back in the courtroom that afternoon, Reynolds watched Judge Thompson handle a series of cases involving police testimony. Each time, the judge masterfully exposed the gaps between perception and reality, between assumed threat and actual behavior. One case particularly struck Reynolds. An officer had arrested a black father for suspicious behavior while he was taking photos of his own house. The man was documenting renovations for his insurance company, but a neighbor's call about a suspicious person had escalated into an arrest. Judge Thompson asked the officer a simple question. If this had been a white man taking pictures of his house in that neighborhood, would you have responded the same way? The silence that followed was deafening. At the end of the day, Reynolds stayed behind to help Judge Thompson organize case files. His mind was swimming with everything he'd witnessed. "Your Honor," he said, sorting through papers, "I keep thinking about something Marcus Johnson's grandmother told me today, about seeing people as people first." Judge Thompson smiled. "That's exactly what this program is about, Officer Reynolds. Every person who comes through that door has a story, a family, dreams, and fears. Our job, yours as an officer, mine as a judge, is to remember that before we make any judgments." Reynolds nodded, picking up his notebook. "I've been reviewing my own traffic stops from the past year. The patterns are disturbing." "Recognition is the first step toward change," Judge Thompson replied. "Tomorrow, we'll start working on specific strategies to help officers check their biases before they act. But for now, I want you to go home and think about one question. What would policing look like if we approached every situation assuming the best about people instead of the worst?" As Reynolds drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he pulled over Judge Thompson just days ago. That moment of prejudice had led him here, to a place of uncomfortable but necessary growth. He realized that true justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. After 2 weeks of intensive courtroom observations, Judge Thompson invited Officer Reynolds to join him for dinner at Carter's, a small family restaurant near the courthouse. The evening crowd was thin, and they found a quiet booth in the corner where they could talk privately. Reynolds noticed how the other diners reacted to their unusual pairing, a white police officer and a black judge sharing a meal. Some stared openly, while others quickly looked away. He was beginning to understand how it felt to be watched, to have people make assumptions about you. "Try the pot roast," Judge Thompson suggested, setting down his menu. Mrs. Carter has been making it the same way for 30 years. As they waited for their food, Reynolds gathered his courage to ask the question that had been bothering him. Your Honor, can I ask you something personal? The judge nodded, stirring his coffee. Of course. How you do it? Stay so calm when dealing with officers who clearly acted on prejudice. If I were in your position, after everything you've experienced. Judge Thompson was quiet for a moment, looking out the restaurant window at the passing traffic. Let me tell you a story, James. May I call you James? Reynolds nodded, surprised by the personal touch. 20 years ago, my son was 16, the judge began. He had just gotten his driver's license. One night, he was driving home from basketball practice when he got pulled over. The officer was aggressive, pulled him out of the car, handcuffed him on the sidewalk. All because someone had reported a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. Reynolds felt his face grow hot with shame, thinking of similar stops he had conducted. When he finally got home, he was crying. Judge Thompson continued, his voice steady but filled with old pain, not from physical hurt, but from the humiliation, from realizing that no matter how well he did in school, no matter how polite he was, some people would always see him as a threat first. Their food arrived, but neither man touched it immediately. I had a choice then, the judge said. I could let anger consume me, or I could work to create change. I chose the harder path, to stay in the system and try to fix it from within. That's why I became a judge. Reynolds thought about his own children at home. I keep thinking about how I would feel if someone treated my kids the way I've treated others. It makes me sick to my stomach. Good, Judge Thompson said firmly. That feeling means you're changing. But guilt without action is useless. What matters is what you do with that understanding. They began eating, the pot roast living up to its reputation. Between bites, Reynolds shared his own revelations from the past 2 weeks. Yesterday, I was reviewing my old body camera footage, he said. I watched myself get aggressive with a man because he questioned why I pulled him over. At the time, I thought I was just being firm, maintaining control. Now I see how scared he was, how I made things worse by escalating. Judge Thompson nodded. Fear works both ways, James. Officers are trained to be afraid, to always expect the worst. But that fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you approach every situation expecting danger, you create tension that didn't need to exist. How do we change that? Reynolds asked, genuinely seeking answers. It starts with conversations like this one, the judge replied. With being willing to see things from other perspectives. With admitting our mistakes and learning from them. As they finished their meal, Mrs. Carter herself came to their table. She was an elderly black woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Judge Thompson, she smiled warmly, then looked at Reynolds with curiosity. An officer, this is a new face. Officer Reynolds is helping me with a special project, Martha, the judge explained. We're working on building bridges. Mrs. Carter's smile widened. Well, it's about time. We need more of that in this city. She patted both men's shoulders before walking away. As they left the restaurant, Reynolds felt different, lighter somehow, despite the heavy conversations. He understood now that this wasn't just about changing his own behavior. It was about being part of a larger change, about helping other officers see what he had finally begun to see. Same time tomorrow? Judge Thompson asked as they reached their cars. Yes, Your Honor, Reynolds replied, then corrected himself. Yes, Marcus. I'll be there. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, Officer James Reynolds stood before a room full of police officers at the department's monthly training session. His hands were steady as he set up his presentation, though his heart was beating fast. Among the audience, he spotted Judge Thompson sitting quietly in the back row, offering an encouraging nod. Good morning, everyone, Reynolds began, his voice stronger than he expected. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here giving a presentation about racial bias in policing, I probably would have laughed, or gotten angry, or both. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reynolds recognized that defensive posture. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. But 3 months ago, I made a traffic stop that changed everything, he continued. I pulled over a black man in an expensive car because, and let's be honest here, he didn't fit what I thought belonged in that neighborhood. The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on him. Reynolds clicked to his first slide, showing his own body camera footage from that night. That man turned out to be federal judge Marcus Thompson, who's here with us today. But here's the thing, his title shouldn't matter. What I did was wrong, whether he was a judge, a doctor, a teacher, or a student. Over the next hour, Reynolds shared everything he'd learned. He showed traffic stop statistics from their own department, revealing patterns that couldn't be explained away. He played body camera footage from his own past stops, analyzing his language, his assumptions, his escalations. "Look at this footage," he said, playing a video from 6 months ago. "Listen to how I speak to this young black woman. Now, compare it to this stop of a white businessman from the same week. The difference is clear, and it's not about their behavior. It's about my assumptions." In the back of the room, Lieutenant Martinez watched with pride. She remembered how skeptical she'd been when Judge Thompson first proposed this program instead of filing a complaint against Reynolds. Now she understood his wisdom. Reynolds moved on to the practical part of his presentation. "We developed new protocols for traffic stops," he explained, distributing handouts. "But more importantly, we've created a system for checking our own biases before we act." He shared the simple but effective checklist he developed with Judge Thompson. Would I make this stop if the driver was a different race? Can I articulate a specific violation, not just a feeling? Am I responding to actual behavior or to assumptions? How would I want my own family member to be treated in this situation? Some of the older officers looked resistant, but Reynolds saw many of the younger ones taking notes. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. After the presentation, Officer Sarah Chen, a rookie Reynolds had been mentoring, approached him. "That was brave," she said. "I've been struggling with some of these issues but didn't know how to bring them up." Reynolds smiled, remembering his own journey. "The hardest part is admitting we need to change. The rest is just work." Later that afternoon, Reynolds was back on patrol, but everything felt different. He saw the community through new eyes, not as potential threats to be controlled, but as people to be protected and served. Driving through his usual route, he passed a black teenager walking home from school. 6 months ago, he might have slowed down, watched the kids suspiciously. Today, he waved and got a surprised smile in return. His radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person in an upscale neighborhood. Reynolds took the call, but as he drove there, he remembered his checklist. When he arrived and found a black woman taking photos of a house, his approach was different from what it would have been before. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said warmly, keeping his distance to avoid appearing threatening. "I'm Officer Reynolds. We got a call from a neighbor. Are you photographing your house?" The woman tensed at first, then relaxed at his friendly tone. "Yes, I'm a real estate agent. This is my new listing." She reached for her business card. "That's great," Reynolds replied. "Would you like me to speak with the neighbor who called? Sometimes people make assumptions they shouldn't." The woman's surprise turned to appreciation. "Thank you, officer. That would be helpful." As Reynolds walked to the neighbor's house, he felt the weight of his badge differently now. It wasn't just a symbol of authority anymore. It was a reminder of his responsibility to protect everyone's dignity and rights, regardless of their appearance or address.